So good evening, and thank you for joining today's event, hosted by the Georgetown Institute of Politics and Public Service at the McCourt School of Public Policy, known to many of us as GU Politics. My name is J.K. Phoenix. I'm a 2023 graduate in the Masters of Public Policy program at the McCourt School, and I currently serve on the GU Politics student strategy team for fellow Elliott Williams. Over the last 2 years, we've been thrust into long-standing challenges and complexities of federal policymakers' ineptitude to deal with our country's most pressing challenges around social justice and race. The political and legislative ramifications of such behavior gripped me because my life and that of other marginalized Americans remain disproportionately affected by several defeating realities. The uneven distributional consequences of present crisis and our country's failure to adequately address such magnitudes became the impetus fueling my desire to join GU Politics' efforts this semester. With that, I am pleased to introduce our guest today, Mr. Wesley Lowery, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist for CBS News and former correspondent for 60 Minutes Plus, Aaron Haynes, a founding member and editor-at-large for the 19th, former Associated Press's national writer on race and ethnicity, primarily covering race, politics, and culture in America. And lastly, Eugene Scott, a national political reporter for the Washington Post breaking news team and Washington correspondent for CNN Politics. We are thrilled to have them join us to discuss what it is like on the front lines of covering the nexus of race, politics, and social justice. Moderating the conversation will be McCourt School of Public Policy Assistant Professor Andrea Headley. Andrea holds an appointment as a visiting scholar of race, policing, and crime at the National Police Foundation and is a scholar of public management, racial equity, and criminal justice policy. Please join the conversation on social media by tagging GU Politics at GU Politics. And please join me in welcoming tonight's guest.
All right, thank you all for being here. We're really looking forward to an engaging discussion, really trying to understand and break down the intersection between race, social justice, politics, and of course, media. On its own, each of those concepts could be talked about at length, but we're really gonna dive into the intersection of them all today. And so I'm gonna start off with some broad questions and then delve a little deeper. And then of course, we're gonna open it up for questions from you all. And so we're looking forward to engaging you all. And so let's just start off really broad with kind of what got you all to the positions that you are in now, and more particularly, what made you interested in covering the race, politics, and social justice issues?
Well, I'm Eugene Scott. I am a DC native, the actual city, and I just remember being a kid watching local news and not seeing my community reflected, and just thinking, they must not know that Black people exist, or that Black people exist outside of crime and sports. And, even back then, this is the 80s, DC probably was ahead of national trends in terms of having diverse staff in their local news. But it still didn't reflect the diversity of the city. And so I knew pretty early that I wanted to be in media to help tell my community stories. And my first journalism job was at BET News on this now defunct show called Teen Summit. And for those of you all who are too young, which I'm sure it's like all of you all, it was a show it's a cast of teen youth reporters telling stories that were related to issues that Black youth cared about. And I just fell in love with journalism then, and so yeah, I've been doing it since. I've done nothing else. Yeah.
I'm definitely about to get on YouTube and look up Teen Summit clips of you. Those will be showing up on Throwback Thursday. Thank you for that tidbit of information that I will use against you at a later date. For me, I'm a native of Atlanta, and so kind of grew up in the shadow of Martin Luther King Jr. and the legacy of the Civil Rights Movement. Really just kind of loomed large over my life. My mom, my grandparents, graduates of historically Black colleges, and so I always kind of instilled that pride and that sense of who I am and from a very young age, and just being interested in our culture and our stories. Journalism came later. I did not, like some people just kind of grew up with ink in their veins. That was not me. But I got to college, needed to pick a major. I'm nosy, I like to meet new people, and I like storytelling. So journalism looked like a pretty good path, right? And I actually got my first job in Atlanta at a small paper that published twice a week. It was a black newspaper called the Atlanta Daily World. And that paper was really what made me fall in love with journalism and what made me fall in love with race reporting in particular, because our charge as one of a handful of reporters, a handful of staff really at that paper, was to go out, pound the pavement, come back with stories to put in that paper twice a week, anything and everything about the fullness of the black community. Just like Eugene was saying, not just stories about crime, not just stories about our best athletes or our best entertainers, but like the black people that were running Atlanta, frankly, whether it was in politics, whether it was in business, covering the inequality in the city, but really just showing the dignity and the humanity of black people was our job week in and week out. And so those stories, a lot of my stories were on the front page of that newspaper, and what that told me was that our stories mattered and our stories were important. And so even when I left the black press, like I went into my career never really forgetting that ethos that was instilled in me in my very, very first job in journalism. And so even though I was not officially a race reporter until many, many years later, at every stop that I made along the way, whether that was the Los Angeles Times, the Orlando Sentinel, and then later the AP, and now at the 19th, I'm always looking for people who are unseen and unheard in our democracy and in our society, and trying to figure out ways to really center their stories and reframe who we think about when we think about who really our neighbors are, who our voters are, who people in power are, and what that can look like.
So I knew I wanted to do journalism from a very young age. I was on my middle school newspaper, my high school newspaper, and then my college newspaper. But it wasn't until a little bit later that I shifted to covering the things that I cover now. I had come up at a time when, I graduated high school in 2008. And so I was watching at the time the election of the first black president. I remember by the time it's the end of college, I'm watching the campaign reporters who were covering 2012. And 2012 was, for many ways, the presidential election of Twitter. It was the first one that kind of played out that way. And I had this envy that I wanted to be Ashley Parker or Phil Rucker, who are out in the at the caucuses in Iowa or at a speech in South Carolina, updating what's going on. And so I had set out in my career to cover politics initially. After an internship at the Boston Globe, and then I went out and did a fellowship at the LA Times, I took a job back in Boston covering local politics. Did that for a year, got another job at the Washington Post covering Congress. But as I covered Congress at the time, John Boehner was the Speaker of the House. The big debates were whether or not Boehner's House would allow for any compromise with the Obama White House, or would they be kind of taken hostage by the Tea Party folks to the right, who had all swept into office the rounds of elections. And so I, in a lot of ways, focused much more on covering the Democratic minority. I didn't imagine I was going to be able to get as well sourced as some of my colleagues in John Boehner's office or Paul Ryan's office, or much less many of the Tea Party senator and congressmen's offices. But I was still interested in what the other caucus was doing. And so that meant covering things like early efforts to try to renew the Voting Rights Act after the Shelby Holder decision invalidated Section 5, or covering the fight to try to renew long-term unemployment extension, which fell to the Democrats trying to convince the Republicans to do it. And so as I covered those stories and covered those issues, I'd always been aware and interested in how race and issues of race and justice factor into the country we live in, and how they make up so much of the foundation of the nation that we live in. But I was always looking for ways into that type of coverage. And so I remember when Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, August 9, 2014, I was a congressional reporter. I was in Michigan covering a primary for some congressional race. I don't even remember who was running at this point. And I remember when I got back to Washington, trying to figure out if there was any way I could help out in the story. Should I call the congressional delegation from Missouri? Should I call the NAACP, because I know them from the voting rights fights? And an editor walked past and said, why don't you just get on an airplane? We need someone on the ground. We don't have anyone there. And so I flew out to Ferguson that day thinking I'd be there for about 3 days. I ended up spending about 3 months on the ground. And then for the 3 years or 4 years that followed, was one of the Post's lead reporters on issues of race, justice, and policing. And so we did a big project called Fatal Force, which sought to track the number of fatal police shootings. We did another big project called Murder with Impunity, where we looked at the breakdown of relationships between the police and black communities based on how rarely black communities receive justice when they're victimized by crime, and contributed to a bunch of the Post coverage in those spaces, and in the years since have continued to kind of hone a specialty around issues of race and justice and where they intersect.
Thank you all for sharing. I think one of the things that all of your stories point out is that it seems like there were somewhat different trajectories, right, that got you all there. But yet we're all here having this conversation, right? And so I want to pick up on one of the things I think I heard Eugene say about, in particular, around making sure that we're seeing people who look like us on the TV and reporting on issues that matter to communities that look like us. And so what is it like being a black journalist in particular reporting on issues around race and justice, both the opportunities and the challenges that present itself?
Well, as a national political reporter right now who covers breaking news, I usually only write about race when it directly intersects with politics, which is always. So, but before, when I was a fellow at GU Politics, I was identity politics reporter for The Fix, which is a political analysis blog in the Post. And so I wrote about race a whole lot. And my session was called Identity Politics in the Trump Era. And so, some days were very difficult, and it is not always easy to separate, my identities from the issues that I'm covering, and I don't feel any. I'm not sure that the old journalistic ethic that I should be as separate from that is one that I yearn to follow. I've been a black person longer than I've been a journalist. And if I ever leave this industry, I will still be black. And so these are the things I think about, and I think it, gives, me not just, I think the fear historically has been that it will give me this bias, and we can talk about whether or not bias is always a bad thing. I don't think it is, but it also gives me this insight and perspective and this knowledge about the American experience that so many people just are not aware of, so many people who read our work. And I'm sure Wesley can talk about this in depth, but one of the things that's been so very difficult in terms of just shock and frustration about the last few years is people who talk about issues between the black community and police as a new thing. Why have I never heard about this? I mean, Aaron, being from Atlanta, can tell you that the relationship between policing and black communities goes back even way before Martin Luther King, as she referenced. But I say all that to say that one of the reasons why so many communities have not heard these stories is because the newsrooms haven't reflected the communities. And even when they've tried to, the topics in which editors greenlit were not always ones of interest to black communities. And so some of the challenges, there's great joy in being able to pitch stories about communities that don't get covered. But the frustration often is those stories don't always get picked. Editors don't always understand your news judgment or think that what you're talking about is as important as it actually is. I think that's been changing a bit over the past few years. I don't think there's any denying after the Obama presidency and after the Trump presidency how important race is in this country and how it intersects with the topics we're talking about, but it's still very difficult at times.
Yeah, I think we've seen that it's absolutely central to our national conversation, right? I mean, whoever thought we were post-racial after Obama, I think has certainly been disabused of that, and the idea that our racialized political climate in the society was going to go away with, President Trump leaving office, I think was also a fantasy, right? I mean, this is here with us. The intersection of race and politics is the story of our time. It is the unfinished business of this democracy, and it is absolutely something that we can continue to unpack because it has not been resolved. You brought up, the myth of objectivity, which I absolutely 100% agree with, and I know Wesley has some thoughts on that as well, which I hope he will speak to because he has written about that so eloquently and put it probably in better terms than I've seen anybody do, especially on the other side of this racial reckoning. But look, I spent most of my career in legacy mainstream media, and I left to start the 19th with my founding mothers because I was frustrated by the reality that political journalism in particular, which I love covering, is still too white and too male. It's been that way for too long, and the best and fastest way I thought I could fix it, especially headed into 2020, which I felt already was the most consequential election that I was ever going to cover, and I covered the Obama elections, but I felt like this was even more consequential than that. But I felt like the best way to really address this and to really say what needed to be said about who and where we were as a country in that moment was to start over. And so that's what we did. That's where I was able to tell stories about Black women being the backbone of this democracy, women being the deciders of this election because we're half the population and half of the electorate. Like, those were things. Sure, I had my dream job before I left to start the 19th. Being national writer on race in America for the Associated Press, the largest, oldest news gathering organization in America, that was the job that I wanted from the time I was an intern at the AP, right? But I ended up getting that job and I'm doing that work. But I'm also thinking, well, race and gender aren't just a storyline of 2020, they're the story of 2020. Why doesn't everybody believe that? Why aren't we all covering this election through that lens? And again, I knew it was because most of the people that were either making decisions or going out and covering those stories were people who did not look like the majority of the rising electorate in this country, right? So I will say, covering politics and also covering the social justice movement, we have gotten a lot more company. That's one thing that has changed over the past several years. There are a lot more Black journalists that are covering politics now than there were when, probably when the Obama era started. A lot more Black journalists and really newsrooms that have come around, much like the country has come around to the awareness that maybe there is a disparity in the way that certain communities are policed, right? That maybe it's more of an issue than just a few bad apples in a police department, that this is a systemic issue that needs to be addressed in a systemic way, and we need to talk about it systemically and on a continuum and not just in terms of isolated incidents that are happening, popping up in cities, right? But I guess, the thing that I would say, you still don't have enough gatekeepers who look like us, who are making the decisions about what stories are and aren't being told, that are making decisions about what narratives are perpetuated and what narratives that we stop perpetuating in terms of persisting inequality and framing of communities. That's something that needs to be different. I think this may be dawning, I'm not sure yet, but I hope that it is, the idea of whiteness as an identity that we need to explore and that we need to unpack a lot more in this country, because that is, there are too many white people in this country who have not had to be thoughtful about their identity and the reality that it is absolutely political and what that means for our politics and how that affects all of us.
I think the question was originally framed kind of like, what is it like to be a Black journalist covering these things? And I think that, Eugene and Aaron did a really great job of kind of setting the landscape, I think, of a lot of these big things. I think very often, to be a Black journalist in a mainstream news organization and to be a Black journalist covering issues of race, right, is to be, one, in and of yourself, a minority in the space in which you're working. And there's a difficulty culturally and structurally very often that you are seen often as the spokesperson for an entire race of people inside of an institution. That can be remarkably difficult. Aaron and Eugene are both very good friends of mine. It wouldn't take us very long to get to some deep disagreements about some things,
sure.
Right? And yet at a meeting at most news organizations, there would be one of the three of us there.
Represented.
And as the conversation turns to race, a bunch of white faces were turned to us, to the one of us, right? and I think I think that's remarkably difficult. I think that historically there's been a big push and pull among Black journalists. We're in a moment where most Black journalists are eager to tell these stories, but not very long ago, it was something that a lot of Black journalists shied away from because they didn't want to become typecast. Right. That you're only able to do the race and culture stuff. You're only able to write about X, Y, and Z. The black journalists are journalists, but Black people are people, right? We have all types of interests. Whether that's chess or opera or sports or news, city hall, right? And so there's very often a concern, I think, sometimes as a Black journalist, as you navigate, are people going to see you as expansively as they might see you otherwise, right? That if I walk into an employer tomorrow and say, you know what I really want to do? I really want to go cover China. I think it's one of the biggest stories. Even with my resume, that's not necessarily how someone is going to see me walking into the room, right? And so I think that there's a difficulty there. I think that to be a Black journalist and cover these issues is to have to interact with a lot of other people, well-meaning people very often, who haven't done the reading that you've done, who don't know what they're talking about. And so there becomes some tension and some frustration there, right? I think that the thing about race and the way race operates in our country is that it does operate in very specific ways. You can do the reading, you can study it, you can figure it out. But most people, and most white people, have not. And yet most of them operate with the confidence as if they have. And so very often you find yourself as someone who then's job it becomes to take on a level of expertise, you constantly find yourself in conversations with people who just actually don't know what they're talking about.
Part of that expertise also comes from living it, right?
Yeah.
In waking up and going to bed thinking about this stuff, as so many Black people in our country do, and as so many white people in our country do not.
Right.
But that gets to what both of you guys were talking about in terms of the idea of bias or objectivity, or how we bring what we bring into a role and into a journalism job, right? And I think that, again, one of the biggest mistakes any of us makes, right? And this isn't just about race, this is about gender, it's about sexuality, it's about any, pick your thing, right? Is that we all, I think we make the mistake of believing that everyone else's experiences are similar to ours in some way, or that our experience is so standardized that we can make value judgments about other people's experiences. Oh, well, no, the police in this town aren't unfair. I've been pulled over plenty of times. They've always been nice to me. And that starts to seep in to journalistic decision-making in terms of the framing of stories, the focus of stories, the play that a story gets. Is this a front page story? Is this a back page story? Is this a year-long investigation? Or is this a one-off that we let the overnight desk do, right? And then also, as the people whose job it is to ask questions, right? So I remember seeing this, and we've seen a marked shift in this since 2014. Yes. But the fact that the shift had to occur at all is evidence of how different things were, what the standard in the industry was. When Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, the Black people in Ferguson, Missouri, believed he'd been executed in the street. And the white people largely were like, there's no way that could ever happen. It would be impossible. Now, it really matters in covering a story in terms of how you ask questions, what evidence you demand, what follow-ups you ask, what you believe is possible, what you believe the realm of possibility is. If you fundamentally don't believe it is possible that a police officer would behave in this way, you're not going to hold them to the same account as if you believe it is completely possible, right? And so around issues of race, justice, disparity, what reporters of color bring to this conversation, and Black reporters specifically, is they bring their lived experiences, and therefore they have a different set of fingers on the temperature of the country as it exists. They can see things that people can't see otherwise. It's one of the reasons that having a diverse newsroom and diverse leadership in newsroom is so important. Walter Lippmann, whose writing leads to this concept of journalistic objectivity, he writes about, it's remarkable because you read his writing and he's actually making many of the same critiques that those who currently critique the system are making. He's on our side, not on the other people's side. He writes that too often the newspaper is a reflection of the world the editors want to see, not the world as it exists, right? And I understand that. It's a natural inclination. It's not a thing that's special to journalists or to us, right? I was watching an old documentary on the early Obama years this morning, right? And so much of the impact and the effect of his campaign was Barack Obama reflected the world we wanted it to be. He gives a speech and says there's not a white America and a black America. Well, that's nonsense. There is a white America and a black America.
Right.
The point was that he gave us something that we could aspire to. It's very natural for us to want, right? And we see this in conversations about, whether it's conversations about critical race theory or about the squad or whomever. We see these in these conversations, and the counter argument very often is it is not going to be attractive to people to tell them how screwed up things are. Like they want to believe, we want to be rah-rah patriotic. Things are great. Yeah. But I think that our job is, and so as the reporter covering these issues, very often you get painted as the cynic or the skeptic, right? Sometimes negative or pessimistic. But I think there's a remarkable optimism in telling the truth about things that are hard, because you wouldn't tell that truth unless you believed it was something that could be fixed.
Yeah.
That the reason we drill in to these questions and ask these hard questions and sit with them in ways that are uncomfortable, and again, this isn't just on race, I think this applies to any number of issues, right? The reason we focus on those things and look at those things is so that we can see them clearly and therefore rectify and remedy them. And I think that so often on issues of race, that has fallen to the handful of black people in the room, because no one else in the room has been willing to look clearly at what is true there. Because when we look clearly, the job of the journalist very often is to hold the mirror up to our society. It's to tell the truth. When I looked at the mirror this morning and noticed that I'm not in the shape I once was in, I could get mad at the mirror. I could stop looking at the mirror. I could say it's a fake news mirror. It's not telling the truth. But it's not the mirror's fault.
I think I have a fake news mirror.
Right?
In the pandemic, I don't know.
And so I think that we have to, I do think that is our job. My mirror's job isn't tomorrow to make me look extra good, to balance out that today I didn't look so great. It's not to, the job of my mirror every day is to tell me the truth. If I don't like what I see, it becomes incumbent on me to fix it.
Right.
And I think that the role of the journalist on these issues, as Aaron said and always says, right, this is the great unfinished work of American democracy. And our job as one of the pillars and institutions of this democracy is to force ourselves to do this work by giving us honest assessments about where we are and where we aren't.
Yeah, and honestly, that's the thing about race reporting. It hews to some of the core tenets of this profession: to right wrongs, to afflict the comfortable, right? To leave behind the most honest and accurate record of who and where we are as a country. Like, to tell the truth about race is to do all of those things.
Right, right. So I have one last question, but I want to encourage students to begin lining up. The mic is to my right, your left. If you have questions, obviously I have lots of questions, and so I can keep going, but definitely line up as you see fit. But I think all of you all started to hint at this, but I want to kind of hit it on the head more directly. And so what is the role of truth-telling as it relates to advancing or hindering justice? And do you have specific examples of that? I have things in my head that I'm thinking about.
What are you thinking about?
And so I'm thinking about, in terms of, I guess, advancing justice, right? Some of your work, Wesley, on like shedding light on data that we never saw before, right? The role of investigative journalism and bringing data and numbers to things that haven't been seen. More recently, I think in my line of work, I study criminal justice, and so what I would consider over-reporting on violent crime as a means to hinder police reform efforts. And so I don't think it's specific to criminal justice, right? And so we can talk about other areas as it relates to any of you all's expertise, but just thinking kind of along those lines.
Well, I think that, but to respond, I appreciate you saying that, because I think that to think about this, right, in the criminal justice space specifically, I think one of the biggest issues we collectively have, I'm not immune from this, right, is that we cover the police a certain way, and that certain way is not a subjective decision that we've made today. Today, this is the best way to cover the murder that happened last night in Washington, D.C. This is how we've learned to cover murder. This is what we do. This is how we operate. And most of us sleep at night thinking that, oh, well, this is based on our journalistic values and all this other stuff, blah, blah, blah. No, it's based that the publication we worked for was founded during a newspaper war, and they could sell more papers that day if they had the grisliest details of the murder yesterday. And if that murder was of a white woman killed by a black guy, well then even better, right? Because the readers will get scared and they'll buy more papers, right? We can't divorce the economic realities from the processes we've developed in journalism. And so for us, I think our job, when we talk about truth-telling, I think people very often think about this in this like crusading way, and we're gonna take down all the, and I think there's a role for that, right? But also, sometimes it's about what questions are we willing to ask and which ones are we not willing to ask? Where are we willing to apply pressure and not willing to apply pressure? We saw a wave of coverage earlier this year about the wave of looting of CVS's in San Francisco or whatnot. And then when we drilled in, we realized there wasn't even a wave of looting. It was like 3 incidents that got caught on camera, right? And so again, but it's, are we willing to actually drill in and ask the real questions, or are we going through the motions? And I think that's so important. I think so much journalism, and everyone's a media critic, and rightfully so, right? And I think that as someone who has been outspoken about issues of media, I understand how that can come across as obnoxiously like holier than thou and whatnot. But I think that in general, the biggest problems with the media is that not enough of our journalism is good enough. That we need to take more time, we need to slow down, we need to ask more questions. If every piece we publish had to go through the investigative desk, our newspaper would look very different. And I think and so on all of these issues, including on issues of race, and especially on issues of race, how do we make sure we are asking all of the questions that need to be asked, not just going through the motions and letting our biases slip into them?
Yeah. Look, race intersects with every aspect of our democracy, every aspect of our society. Race is political, politics are racial. I will take a minute to plug my friend here because you asked about, the role of institutions in perpetuating inequality, right, or in advancing justice, right? So last week, Wesley published in the pages of the Philadelphia Inquirer. I live in Philadelphia now, and am shepherding a project called A More Perfect Union. That project is about an interrogation of many of the institutions that were founded in Philadelphia, whether we're talking about the first university, the first hospital, the first penitentiary, the first police department. There were many things that were started in Philadelphia, and if we talk about kind of the stories that we like to tell about who and where we are as a country, we also have to talk about the reality that inequality was born in those institutions and therefore was born in Philadelphia. And so we are looking at that foundational history as a vehicle for a conversation about Philadelphia as a place that fashions itself the cradle of democracy, right? So, and of these founding ideals that are not fixed in 1776, but in fact are things that we can carry forward as people, as citizens of this country living today who are very invested in where this democracy goes from here. So coalition that is much more inclusive than it was at the time of the revolution, but the idea that the revolution is absolutely ongoing and is something that we can participate in together, starting in Philadelphia and hopefully rippling out into the rest of the world. And so we started that project with a look at the Philadelphia Inquirer. It's one of the oldest newspapers in America. Journalism is an institution that was not immune from the national reckoning on race. And so it's a story about the 193-year-old Philadelphia Inquirer, but it's also a story about American journalism and its role in perpetuating inequality, in perpetuating narratives that flatten Black America, that have worked to criminalize Black people in this country, that have worked to devalue our communities and diminish really our contribution to this country in so many ways. And so this is the beginning of a year-long conversation, but I think also a challenge for that newspaper, for all of American journalism, to make a different choice going forward, right? We know what the problem is. We know that some places are very sorry for what they have done, but are not acknowledging the ongoing harm and are not committed to making an overhaul that could get them to making the system very different instead of kind of incremental change that does not ultimately change the entire system.
Yeah, no, I thought they were both very thorough in their answers, and I want to make sure students have time. So
yeah, that's a great panelist.
I can skip. Yeah.
All right, so we will open it up. Please definitely share your name with us and your question.
Hello, my name is Ife. I'm a freshman in the college. Thank you so much for all of you coming here tonight. I just want to say, for me at least, it's very inspiring and very nice to see all of you up there. So throughout this time, you've been talking about how important it is to share the story of how this country treats race and treats Blackness. And even when it comes to the police and how we portray the police and how the police treat Black people. But a lot of people don't want to hear that story in America. And a lot of people don't want to hear the stories of all the other ways that race and gender have affected people and still continue to affect people. And so my question is, how do you tell the story that people don't want to hear?
Well, Ife, that's an amazing question, and thank you for being here. I'm glad to see you out there too. Look, I don't care if they don't want to hear it. I'm being so serious. I don't care if they don't want to hear it, because sure, I mean, like, we love the stories that make us feel good, right? We love the stories that reinforce what we want to believe about who we are, right? We just had a whole presidential election where the question was, is this who we are? Well, yes. This is who we are. This is who we say we want to be. The election is about where do we go from here, right? My job is not about protecting people's feelings, anyone's feelings. People from my community, people who are not from my community, people who look like me or share my lived experience or not. My job is to tell the truth, right? And I choose to do that through the lens of race and gender, but my responsibility is to tell the truth.
Let me add something, though, to push you all a little bit, if I may. And in particular, Erin, you're co-founder of this company, right? It is still a company. And so thinking about the bottom line, and I can imagine people probably think, like, is this going to impact the dollar? And so what do you think the role is of trying to think about the bottom line and then truth telling?
Sure. It is not just morally appealing, it is economically appealing to speak to, first of all, half the country, right? But also the LGBTQ community, who is not seeing themselves reflected in mainstream national media, not nearly enough, right? We did not envision starting the 19th in a pandemic at all. We were a pandemic baby. We started 3 months before the pandemic hit. I thought my job was going to be to cover the 2020 election, which was the Super Bowl wrapped in the World Series, wrapped in the Olympics, okay? Like, that was going to be my job. I was ready to do that. But then the pandemic hits, we have to pivot. And, this coverage continued to resonate with people who had not felt seen and heard, and they responded to that, right? I mean, they are supporting us with memberships. They are supporting us with philanthropic support. They are supporting us with private donor support, because it is a mission that makes sense, and it is a mission that people want to invest in. So, I mean, the idea that, sure, there are plenty of people who don't want to hear what we have to say, but there are plenty of people who do. Yeah. And those people are speaking with their wallets as well, which we fully appreciate.
Well, it just really briefly, because I want to make sure we get to all the student questions as well. I do think that, and Erin and I talked about this a lot. Erin didn't mention that she edited the piece I wrote about the Inquirer. But one of the components to it was looking at the economic realities over the years, and looking at how time and time again the paper would prioritize chasing a white suburban reader, and what did that mean about what it covered and what it didn't cover. The shorthand for that in a lot of cities. This is true in Cleveland, where I grew up. It's true in Philadelphia, right? As you see a lot of the white residents empty out of the urban centers in the 60s and 70s, create the American suburbs, right? And the newspapers try to chase those readerships out there, and it was. And the shorthand in many of those newspapers was that the suburban readers don't want to read about what's happening in the city. That if you're writing for someone in Royal Oak or Troy, they don't want to know about the murder in Detroit last night or what those people are up to and what's going on. They want to read about what's happening out where they are, right? And so I think that there is I just finished teaching a class at Colorado College. Our class was the history and future of American journalism. And one of the big things we talked about was about the way the economic pressures factor in to the decisions that are made, and can we have, writ large, the media we deserve in a world in which we have to play in a capitalistic sandbox with, we're all serious, rigorous journalists, right? And work for great, important places, right? The reality is the most influential news organization in the country is Fox News. And they're making billions of dollars beyond anything we're ever going to do, right? And so, and that they are a counterweight in many ways to the type of journalism that other people are doing, right? And they are certainly not alone.
And a counterweight to the absence of local journalism that has disappeared from so many cities in the middle of this country.
And so I think it's both. I think covering these issues, employing these people, telling these truths is journalistically imperative. I think it's a question that remains to be seen if at scale we can have the journalism that our democracy needs in a world where we've got to compete with anyone else who can slap whatever else they want on the internet and call it journalism.
Right, right. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. We will take the next question.
Hi. Oh, this is quite tall. Hi, I'm Aida. I'm a senior at Georgetown. I'm so happy this panel is happening. I don't think we have enough events like this at Georgetown, so it's really nice to see everything that's happening today. So I have kind of a question specific to how we see fact versus opinion. So opinion sections, I think personally it's very easy for me to dismiss an opinion writer I don't like in whatever major newspaper, but sometimes they do have authority on those issues. And then the counter to that is that journalists who tend to focus on race and focus on other more diverse issues are seen as okay, but this isn't fact. You're presenting it as opinion, and that's very frustrating to deal with. Yeah. And it doesn't just happen on a national level. It also happens on a campus level. That happened recently where someone in the biggest newspaper presented changes about the room that is in Healy Hall and how its legacy pertains to slavery, basically presented it as incorrect, and it's just wrong. Anyway, just wanted to give some context that it happens here at Georgetown too, where I feel people are very critical and introspective. So how do you kind of deal with that, and where do we even go from there if it's so polarized to the point where you can just dismiss something as opinion rather than fact?
Well, the best opinion writers used to be reporters, in my experience, and it includes reporting. Opinions aren't just, this is what I feel and what I believe. And at respectable outlets, there are media organizations where people do just get to, spout whatever they think is true, and that has been, problematic and hurtful to all of us who consume news. But the best columns are filled with reporting and filled with facts. And if student journalists aren't doing that, they're doing themselves a disservice, especially if they seek to build careers in journalism long term, and obviously doing their readers a disservice. I mean, opinion writing is not as far from reporting as I think some people tend to believe it is.
Yeah, I think that there's a journalism historian who said that the role of the press is to do two things. It's to provide fact and to provide a forum to debate those facts. Those are the two fundamental functions of what the press does. And I think that we have to think about when we honestly survey our landscape, and this is something I asked of my students, where do we think it is on the scale? Are we receiving 80% fact and 20% forum? Are we receiving 80% forum and 20% fact, right? And one thing I do think that is true is that, forum is easy. Right, it's easy for us to have opinions about things and express opinions about things. The process of, and I agree with Eugene completely, the best opinion writers do this type of work, right? Report, but reporting is expensive. It takes resources. It takes time.
Hot takes are cheap.
It is, right? That when Aaron and I did this piece in the Philadelphia Inquirer, I interviewed somewhere between 75 and 85 people, which meant that we were, 3-4 weeks past the deadline by the time I was giving her the thing I was supposed to give her. Because reporting takes time. Double and triple checking things takes time, right? And so much of our media is produced so quickly, in such a vacuum, right? And again, going back to something I said earlier, I think the biggest problem with most media is not bias, it's that the journalism's not good, the reporting's not there. We didn't take the time. Right, that we would never choose in a vacuum to tell the story this way. Maybe we don't have all the facts by the 7 o'clock newscast. Maybe 7 p.m. is not the ideal time to tell all of Washington what happened, because we might not know yet. Well, that doesn't matter. We got to be on the news. By our 9 p.m. print newspaper deadline, we might not know everything. This might not be the ideal way to tell this story, yet this is what we're going to do every single day. And so what ends up happening is we end up, and there used to be, and we understand why that used to be iterative, and it was iterative this way. But our media landscape and ecosystem has just changed so drastically. Something can get around the world in a matter of seconds that it really does matter. Did you really call that person for comment? Did you really get a hold of it? It really does matter if we get it was a black hoodie instead of a gray one. It matters because suddenly within moments, millions of people around the entire world could have a sudden impression of something that happened or did not happen. And so I think that it speaks to our need and our ability to go that extra mile and go above and beyond. And frankly, I wish, like I said, I think that so much of our landscape right now is quick, easy forum. And don't get me wrong, I'm not someone who's calling for less speech and less ability for people to debate. Not at all. But I think that really erodes the ability of the reader to trust and understand what they're receiving. If you open your Facebook feed right now and pick the first 15 links, I guarantee 7 of them are trash. It's an aggregation of an aggregation, it's someone's blog post about, blah. Well, so what's the reader supposed to do when they encounter, we've all learned the lesson the hard way to not trust the stuff that we encounter. And it's very difficult for us to sort through what's legitimate and what's not. And that's only further complicated by the fact that even a lot of the places that work really hard and do really good work do get things wrong. Are moving quickly, are stumbling down the thing. And by the way, there's an entire political party that has spent 50 years seizing every one of those things and blasting it around and see, this is why you can't trust them. And so I think we've got a real crisis as it relates to that. I think the only way to fix that is by upping our game.
Thank you for that. We will take our next question.
This is very tall. Hi, my name is Suhani. I'm a junior at Georgetown, and as the students before me said, I'm so happy that you all are here. I just feel like I've been learning so much just in this short time. And one thing that's really stuck out to me throughout this discussion has been your conversation about the myth of objectivity, and especially, Wesley, what you said about often we can't even ask the right questions if certain things are just completely beyond our conception of what's possible. Yeah. And I know one common critique of academia is that it's so just disconnected from reality. I know that I'm often, taught theories and models in my classes that are just based on assumptions that I know are not true. So the question that I have for you, as journalists who are covering the real world, the actual lived realities of communities, what would you have to say to students who are trying to be truthful in our analyses of our communities and our world, who are trying to ask the right questions, despite the very limited range of stories that our classes present as possible?
That your lived experience is an asset to that work. It is not a liability. Don't let anybody tell you that what you know because of how you grew up, where you are from, what you've experienced, that is not valuable fodder for inquiry, to challenge what may be being presented to you as established or true. That you absolutely have an obligation, really, to challenge those narratives and to try to broaden and expand those narratives to be more inclusive of the world that is not necessarily the one that is being portrayed to you in those settings.
I think the one thing that's important is, and I don't think activist organizers talk about this a lot. I don't think we in journalism talk about it a lot. But who are we accountable to? Who are we in community with?
Each other.
Right?
As
And we are,
yeah.
right? I think too often our news organizations have covered certainly Black America, but I think all minority America, immigrant America, gay and lesbian, transgender America. We've covered it like people who are at the moon landing.
Rural America.
We've just dropped into a place and we're like, look at all these things, with no accountability, right? With no sense of, and I think that one of the ways we get at truth and get at nuance and get at complications, one of the ways we know to ask the right questions are being in real community and having real accountability with people. And I think that is so important, right? Is this something coming from the ivory tower? That I've decided with all of my knowledge and research that the question to ask is this. Well, cares what I think?
Correct.
Right?
It's more about what you don't know.
And how do I know what I don't know? Right? I mean, Kevin Merida, who's now the editor of the LA Times, he would always say, when he was managing editor at the Post, and I worked under him, he would always say, not always, but very often would say, sounds like we need more reporting. It sounds like the solution to this problem is more reporting. Have we talked to more people? And I think that that's something, and I think that that's something that's applicable in academia as well, right? That if what we're looking at in this study is about housing, or it's about food deserts, it's about, have we actually spoken to the people in this space? Is this the question they want us asking? Is this the right way to run the data? This was, and I think that accountability, being in community with people, not writing about them, but writing actually for them and servicing them, is one of the ways to tear down those walls.
Thank you. I think we have one last question.
Hello, everyone. Thank you three for joining us and Professor for moderating this event. My name is Emily. I'm a senior in the SFS, and I have been truly excited and appreciate this event immensely. So my question is looking at the effects of storytelling on the storytellers. Many ways, you are the ones on the front lines. You're the ones who get comments from folks, whether it's by email, comments on your story, and sometimes they are certainly saying kindly, they're not pleasant. And so with this, how have you found yourselves finding communities of care? How do you address this? I think we've seen crowdfunding at times for reporters to address their mental health and well-being. What do you think this speaks to journalism now and the future, and what can be better? Thank you.
Well, look, I'll just say, I will take this opportunity, first of all, to toot the horn of the 19th, which, our CEO going into starting our newsroom, I mean, it was not just about the kind of coverage that we felt like was lacking and that we wanted to see. It was really about the newsroom culture that, frankly, a lot of us wish that we had earlier in our careers. Mm-hmm. And part of that was absolutely about care, whether you're talking about healthcare, whether you're talking about mental health, but really just the concept of empathetic leadership and what that looks like to really model in a newsroom, and leadership that really is across the organization, whether that's the person that's at the very top or somebody who is a rank and file member of the organization, but also feels agency to speak up and say what it is that they want and need in order for them to be their best selves when they are coming into work every day, right? Or to have the freedom to say, look, I'm not my best self today, and for that to be okay for them to speak up and say, right? And so, I think about so many of the benefits that we have at the 19th that speak directly to that. Our healthcare is 100% covered at the 19th, which is remarkable. And those benefits are really, the same benefits that the CEO gets are the same benefits that I get, the same benefits that somebody who's, just starting out and that has come to work with our organization gets. That's really powerful. I think I can say, I remember when we were on the ground in Ferguson, the group chat was probably, that was our therapy at that time. We were leaning on each other, really, as Black journalists who were kind of going through this shared experience. We maybe kind of had, gallows humor in a group text thread was what was substituting for therapy now. Luckily, I think a lot of the journalists that have come behind us who really are prioritizing things like self-care and mental health have helped to normalize the reality that this is traumatic reporting, especially for those of us who share lived experience with a lot of the communities that we are covering. And that's true not just for us as Black journalists, but for LGBTQ folks who are living through this real backlash to a lot of their communities, especially the trans community in this country right now. We have trans reporters on staff at the 19th who are living the reporting that they are doing. And so to be able to be supported, not just in terms of the benefits, but really just to have a newsroom that gives a damn, about them as people, right? In addition to the work that they are doing, I think that does represent a shift in the newsroom culture that feels very important.
Yeah, and I think also it's important. I've seen journalists like ourselves who've been in the industry longer, just to be way more vocal about our mental health and going to therapy in ways that were not the case when I was just starting out. And therefore, I think younger reporters hopefully know that this is something that should be prioritized.
I feel like they're driving it.
Yeah.
I really feel like they're driving it.
100%.
Yeah, and so it, I mean, it's just such a different industry right now when we think about some of the things we've seen and we write about, and our desire and priority to care for our souls and our hearts and our brains as we process all of these things for people. And I fortunately had editors who completely understood, and I could leave early if I had a therapy appointment or something related to it, and because they understood that was what was most important for me as an individual, but also as an employee. And so I think speaking up about that is key.
Yeah, I think that for a really long time in our industry, the mindset or the assumption was that the thing you have to protect, the thing we care about, is the institution, right? Everyone else is a cog in the wheel. And I think that we are belatedly but appropriately shifting to an understanding that the people are the institution. That to care for the Washington Post is to care for the people who work for the Washington Post, right? Or to care for the New York Times is to care for the people who work for the New York Times. I think there was a default newsroom culture for a long time that is like, well, we've all been traumatized, so good for you, right? And it was the old war stories of this time when we almost got shot at this thing, or this thing that happened, or this. And look, I love war stories too. But I think that was very often a means of us all trying to deal with unresolved and unmitigated trauma and difficulty. The fact that we've been put in some really hard scenarios and situations. I think about the fact that, when I worked at the national desk of, the Post and other places, and none of this is unique to the Post, this isn't a criticism of the Post, right? I would spend a week at a hurricane watching people die, and I very often was the one whose job was I was on the victims team. I was literally counting the bodies. And at the end, we wouldn't have a conversation about it. We'd just move on to the next thing. All right, time for the tornado. Yeah. Time for that there was almost never a debrief, an exhale, a sit down, hey, by the way, you need a week off, or do you, I from 2014 through 2016, I was on the ground in every city where there was any protest or demonstration about a police killing, and was getting tear gassed and arrested and doing all this, and had.
Not to mention just processing the killing itself.
Yeah, much less what the actual thing is we're writing about. Forget all that, all this other stuff. And could count on one hand the number of conversations I had with people of power influence about how I was doing or what was going on. I think that we've shifted. I mean, it's been remarkable because talking in public over these years, I would for years get asked these questions, well, what do you do for self-care? And I have to make up a lie, because I'd never even thought about that before, right? It wasn't a thing that was... Right. And so I do think that this rising generation of students, of journalists, have forced a conversation that is different and forced us to conceptualize this in ways that's different. I think that it's incumbent upon our institutions to do better about this, like how they take care of their people really, really matters. But I also think that for a lot of us, the idea of, and look, it's something I think about a lot, I've been thinking about a lot right now, like how we lean on our networks, how we lean on our people. That a week or two ago, Aaron and I, I was not in a great mood. I've been going through some stuff, and Aaron and I sat on the phone and watched a movie, right? We were in different places, right?
Shout out to Inventing Anna.
Right,
very
but
good,
we were like, oh, Shonda Rhimes has some new white mess on Netflix. Let's watch this, right?
We're here.
And so, but I think that it's that idea of support, and it's great. All of us individually, as we move through life, understand how we have to build our support systems and understand where our limits are. I think that one of the keys, especially with the amount of vitriol that might come in, given the internet and whatnot, I think newsrooms are having to really rethink the ways they support their people, the cultures and structures and societies they build within. And I'm encouraged by how different this conversation is today than it was a decade ago when I started, right? But I also could only imagine what that looks like a decade from now. And I think, and I really do think all of those things are for the good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I was just going to say one thing to Wesley's point. I think, because you mentioned this, and what's I think really important when, in the past when an individual may express some of the challenges that they have from, like, internet vitriol or hate mail or phone calls, and more experienced editors would say we all have these war stories. I think we are in a time where we are being very clear and having to admit that women, people of color, LGBT people are getting attacked in ways that are very different from
and
white
it's
men.
not just part of the job,
Yeah,
which is
it's
what
not.
a lot of us just accepted
Right,
for
they're
a long
like, you
time.
just deal with it. I'm like, no, I've been called the N-word in Twitter. I've been called a fag, or just all of these slurs based on my identity as a Black gay man. And I did not sign up for that.
Hello.
And it was a huge shock for me, because I started my journalism career before Twitter, so that
Right.
wasn't how things always were. And some days are harder than others. And the networks, cheap plug, we're all big supporters and fans of the National Association of Black Journalists, which has given us all a community to process so much of this with. And so it having, as has been said, other people who can experience what you're experiencing, but make it very clear that, this isn't just stuff you can shake off all the time, or that you should have to tolerate. I think it's been really helpful in how managers respond to this.
Yes.
Thank you all for an enriching and engaging discussion. I know we spent time talking a little bit about everything, but I love the fact that we ended on notions of community and the importance of community support in pursuing the truth, and that is really fundamental and needed for pursuing the truth. And so I invite you all to help me thank our panelists with a round of applause.